The Golden Amazons of Venus by John Murray Reynolds. From Planet Stories, Winter 1939. As found on Project Gutenberg. Read by Julie Hoverson. The Golden Amazons of Venus, Part 8. One minute the strange city had been clearly visible before them, its graceful towers agleam with lights as they notched the sky. The next instant, the whole place was gone. There was nothing in sight at all but a low shoreline. It was as though a thick veil of concealing mist had been suddenly drawn across between the ship and the city. Only, the air was clear and without a trace of mist. Jerry walked across to the open dome of the upper control room. "Cut rockets," he snapped. "Get some kind of an anchor overboard. We'll just stay right here offshore until morning. There's something queer going on." Jerry and Steve Brent leaned on the rail together, peering through the darkness toward the island. Nothing was visible in the faint phosphor glow that marked the Venusian night, but they could just hear a distant singing as of many voices lifted in chorus. "What do you think happened to the city so suddenly?" Steve asked. Jerry shrugged. "I suppose some mist hit it." "There wasn't any mist," Steve said flatly. "Anyway, we could see the low hills on shore just as clearly after the city disappeared as before. Anyway, listen," Jerry interrupted. Now they could again hear the sound of bells coming across the water. Half the time the sound was swept away by the night breeze. Half the time they could just hear it. The bells were of many blended tones and notes, an immense carillon. They were singing some outland melody that was full of the surge of ocean breezes and the cries of the seabirds. It rose and swelled and died away again. "The city's there all right," Jerry said slowly, "though I can't imagine why we don't see any lights with the sound of the bells that close. But we'll see in the morning." "I tell you, there is no city," Closana said, her voice troubled. "We have often sailed ships into these waters from the Savisan coast, and we know that none of these outer isles are inhabited. What you have heard must be the ghosts of the old ones, ancient phantoms speeding through the skies. There is a legend that the bells of their phantom ships can sometimes be heard off the coast at night." "Ghosts or no ghosts, we're going ashore there in the morning," Jerry said stubbornly. All night the Viking rode to a crude anchor that Angus had improvised from some spare parts on board. The spaceship's designers had never expected her to lie in water. Most of the crew were on deck as soon as it grew light enough to see. Ahead of them, less than a half a mile away, stretched a sandy shore backed by a line of low hills. The island had a wealth of the yellow vegetation typical of the mainland of Venus, so that it had a more friendly appearance than the other specks of land which dotted the great sea and were only bare rock. But there was no sign of life. Certainly there was no trace of any city. There was not even an indication of human habitation at all. As the dawn mists cleared away, they could see that another range of hills stretched along the horizon some miles behind. Their greenish-yellow slopes were clear and sharp against the cloudy sky beyond, and they were located well in the rear of where the city had appeared to be in that hasty glimpse the night before. "Ready the landing party," Jerry commanded. "Full armor and equipment." They gently beached the spaceship on the sloping expanse of sand, running her nose a little way up above the water level while the light surf lapped her dripping sides. Some giant crabs scurried away across the beach in startled surprise. "Want to go ashore, Angus?" Jerry asked as McTavish's red-bearded face came up through an escape hatch. The big engineer shook his head. "I'll just stay aboard here and brood over my broken helicopters, thanks. My last trip ashore took care of all my wanderlust for the present." Jerry took half the vessel's crew with him, leaving the other half on guard. Closana went with the landing party. With their armor gleaming in the golden light, ray guns, and other weapons ready, they tramped up across the loose sand of the beach. Beyond the shoreline was firmer ground, a field of some low plants that grew in orderly yellow rows. "I'll swallow my ray tube if this isn't a field cultivated by man. Nature was never that orderly," Steve Brent muttered. Jerry shrugged. "Lord knows. If we ever get those helicopters fixed, I'm all for a quick return to Earth. This planet is certainly no peaceful Garden of Eden, and I've had pretty near all I want of it. Savisa was the only place I really liked. I wonder what's happening there now. We'll know if anything very exciting turns up, Steve said. When we started out on our search after you disappeared that night, I left Tanda behind with a portable radio to keep us posted. Sort of figured it was our base on Venus, and anyway, there was always the chance you might wander back there. Great planetoids, I just thought of something. As soon as we get back to the ship, remind me to radio Tanda to tell Rupin Sang that the scaly ones had learned to use the old sewers, and that he must either block them off or place a heavy guard there. Duh. For a mile they walked inland across those odd fields. The orderly rows of plants stretched off to the horizon on both sides. And then they came to a kind of level plain. The ground before them was strange-looking, so strange that Jerry called a halt while he stared down the slight slope at it. Most of the plain was of bare rock that was absolutely smooth and level without any signs of weathering at all. Along the outer edge it was pitted at regular intervals by what looked like shallow wells a foot in diameter. Beyond that zone were many excavations of many sizes and shapes, all cut down into the solid rock with the sides perfectly straight and smooth. Jerry took off his helmet and scratched his head. Now what do you make of that? Well, I know what it looks like to me, Steve said. It looks just like the foundations of a city, without the city. Those round pits are the anchorages of the outer wall. Those square holes are the basements of tall buildings. Only somebody has lifted the whole city away. You're crazy, Jerry growled. Steve shrugged. Maybe we all are. Anyway, I'm going to take a look into one of those holes. Steve walked quickly forward toward the nearest of the round pits. Suddenly, just as he reached the very edge of the zone of bare rock, there was a dull clash of steel. Something had seemed to pick Steve up bodily and hurl him backward. He landed flat on his back on the ground, his helmet bouncing off and rolling a few feet away. It hit me, he shouted. What did? I don't know. Steve sat up and rubbed his head. You know, Chief, it really felt more as though I'd just walked squarely into a solid stone wall. Dumbass. It has just occurred to me, Jerry said slowly, that maybe that's exactly what you did do. Jerry walked forward cautiously, a foot at a time, one hand stretched out before him. When he reached a spot on line with the place where Steve had been stopped, his hand encountered something cool and firm and smooth. It was like the surface of a highly polished stone wall, or a sheet of heavy and invisible glass. He ran both his hands over it. The thing was continuous and solid. There was nothing visible to the eye, and he could see far ahead of him across the strangely surfaced rocky plain. But there was an impenetrable barrier blocking the path. Stepping back a few feet, Jerry picked up a pebble and tossed it upward. The stone bounced back sharply as soon as it came in line with the invisible barrier. He threw the pebble higher, and the same thing happened. There was something mysterious and disquieting about the way the stone would soar up into the clear air, and then sharply bounce back from a point in space where nothing at all was visible. Magic! Clozana said nervously. Even the Earthmen of the landing party had drawn together in a compact group, ray tubes ready and eyes alert. Jerry moved back a few feet farther, then hurled the stone forward and upward as high as he could. This time the pebble did not bounce back. It simply vanished in thin air. And then, from somewhere off in the emptiness of space above them, there came the sound of a deep and mocking laughter. Go away, or I shall taunt you a second time. As though that first laugh had somehow eased the necessity for a carefully enforced silence, there came a whole burst of unseen and eerie merriment. There was a murmur of many voices, then it died away again. There was still nothing visible, and the silence was once more unbroken. And your father smelt of elderberry. For Lord's sake, let's get out of here, Portok gasped. This place is ghost-ridden. There are no ghosts here, little red-faced man, boomed a voice. The sound had seemed to come from somewhere overhead, from the empty void above, where there was nothing at all until the cloud canopy was reached many thousands of feet up. One of the Vikings' crew bared his teeth in a sudden panic and lifted his ray gun to fire blindly upward. Before he could pull the trigger, there was a blinding blue flash and a crash like summer thunder. Captive lightning! The ray gun flew from the man's hands and landed a few feet away, its wooden stock badly charred and its barrel a glowing mass of fused metal. "Let your weapons rest, for they are useless here!" commanded that same booming voice from above. "Whence came ye, strangers in odd clothing who have traveled in a ship like a blue whale? What do ye seek here in the outer isles?" Jerry stepped forward a few feet ahead of the group. He shouted that they were a scientific exploring party who had come from Earth in a spaceship. There was a brief period of silence, as though men consulted in whispers. Then the voice called him again. "You there, the leader! The Council of Elders will talk with you. Go 50 paces to your right, to where there are 2 white stones, and then come forward between them. Do not be afraid, you will not be harmed." "Are you going to take the chance, Chief?" Steve whispered. Jerry nodded. "I'll have to." About 50 yards to his right, Jerry saw 2 white stones. They were set some 12 or 15 feet apart, on the very edge of the invisible barrier. Jerry walked over, turned left, and then walked squarely in between the stones. He held one arm protectingly in front of him, but this time his hand did not encounter any barrier. Instead, he found himself standing under the archway of a gate, with a mighty city spread before him. The city had simply appeared in a flash, with its mighty towers soaring up to the sky as soon as he stepped over the outer line of the arch. Whatever it was that held the place invisible from outside, it had ceased to function for him as soon as he came within the limits of the outer surface of the walls. Glancing back, he saw that his companions were still staring blankly at the spot he had just quitted. They were evidently unable to see either him or any part of the city. "It's all right, Steve," he shouted. "Just hold everybody there till I come back." Doors of heavily carved glass slid noiselessly out of recesses within the wall to close the gate through which Jerry had just entered. The arch in which he stood was inside the thickness of the wall, faced with white marble inlaid with designs in gold. Ahead, he could see a broad avenue that ran from the gateway down through the center of the city. It was tree-lined and pleasant, thronged with people. Flowers grew in little plots in front of the gold and white houses. Small furry animals, dogs, were evidently kept as pets. They drowsed on the doorsteps or scampered about the neat gardens. Half a dozen men were standing around Jerry within the arch of the gate. They were slight in stature, though wiry, with heads a little larger than normal, and exceptionally high foreheads. Their skin bore a tawny tinge similar to that of the Amazons of Savisa. 2 of them, who immediately took up posts just inside the glass portals of the gate, wore a semi-military uniform that included a gilded helmet. The others wore white cotton tunics and high leather shoes. It suddenly struck Jerry that this was the first place on Venus that he had visited where the majority of the citizens did not go heavily armed at all times. Perhaps it was a good omen. One of the men stepped forward, a bearded and gray-haired man who bore a gold-tipped staff. "I am Ghoul, chairman of the Council of Elders of Morn," he said in the deep voice that Jerry had heard outside. "The council has decided to see you at once. You are the first outsider who has been permitted to enter the city of Morn, White Queen of the Outer Isles, in countless generations. It would not have been permitted even now if you had been a man of this planet. Come with me." They went up a flight of steps and climbed into a metal car that hung from an overhead rail, supported by columns along the street. Ghoul touched a button and the car shot ahead at high speed along the overhead monorail. The old man, who had settled comfortably back on one of the upholstered seats, was faintly smiling as he watched Jerry's face. "You are puzzled, stranger?" he asked at last. "Yes. There seemed to be nothing on the plane but a lot of holes bored in the rock, and now you find yourself in the city of Morn," Ghoul said. "A knowledge of dimensional control is one of the reasons why we of the city have lived in peace and safety for so many centuries, while the rest of the planet is torn by constant wars." "Dimensional control?" Jerry said slowly. Ghoul nodded. "Yes. It is hard to put it into language that will be clear to one who has no knowledge of our science. Perhaps I can explain it by saying that the human eye is a 3-dimensional organism, and therefore capable of perceiving only things that fall into that same category. There are a great many things in the universe, some of the greatest importance, that the ordinary man's senses are incapable of perceiving. We have learned how to cast a protective screen of fourth dimension rays about our city, and the effect is that it becomes completely invisible to the human eye. Do I make myself clear? Not entirely, Jerry grinned, but I do know that your screen works. But since your science is so far ahead of the other people of Venus, why don't you rule the entire planet? The other races are all barbarians, Ghoul said with a sort of disdainful gravity. We prefer to live here in our peaceful isolation and not bother with them. That is an essential part of our philosophy. The speeding monorail car mounted higher as it neared the center of the city. The track seemed to end on the blank wall halfway up the tallest of the buildings. But as the car came near, a circular doorway suddenly opened just in time to let it through. They halted in a circular chamber where heavy springs caught and allayed the last of the car's momentum, and a pair of gold-helmeted guards saluted Ghoul as they helped him to alight. "The council is ready and waiting, my lord," said one. Ghoul nodded over his shoulder to Jerry. "Follow me," he commanded. The Council of Elders of Morn sat at a U-shaped table in a high-ceilinged room, whose walls were hung with heavy and very ancient tapestries. The dozen members of the council were all old men, graybeards who seemed dwarfed by the high-backed chairs in which they sat. They listened with grave attention to Jerry's account of what he had seen of conditions on Venus, but their austere faces showed no sign of animation when he again suggested that they should intervene in the planet's affairs. "We are not interested," Ghoul said listlessly. Suddenly the shortwave alarm in Jerry's helmet buzzed loudly. He pressed the receiving switch. "Listen, Chief!" Steve Brent's voice was tense and excited as it came from the earphones. "I just got a message from Tanda back in Lar. There's hell to pay back there. The scaly ones have in some way managed to storm one of the barrier forts, and now they're pouring over the borders of Savisa in great hordes. They're armed with supode rays, too." Jerry switched off the radio and leaned forward with his hands on the carved table. "Now is the time for you to act," he snapped. "Lanza is a madman. He plans to overrun all Venus. If you come to the aid of the Amazons at this time, it will—" "Our isolation of centuries is not to be broken," Ghoul interrupted. Watching the emotionless faces of the Council of Elders, he felt as though he were wading through mud. He was getting nowhere. The inertia of these graybeards was a leaden and tangible thing. "But if Lanza wins, he may come after you," he urged. "Your walls are invisible, but they're there. I could feel them with my hands. Now that Lanza has the equipment to project the supode ray, he may bring them down and—" "We take no part in what goes on outside our walls," Ghoul repeated firmly. "We will give you the metal to repair your own ship. If you and some of your men wish to return quickly to the mainland in the meantime, we will send you across in our flying cars. That is the most we can do." Half a dozen flying cars rested on a broad platform on top of one of the walls of the city of Morn. Many bells were tolling the noonday chimes as Jerry Norton led his armored men from the Viking aboard the compact little flying machines. There was room for 6 men in each car, the pilot and 5 passengers. Only Angus and the necessary assistants had remained behind to repair the spaceship with the materials supplied by the men of Morn. Jerry leaned from his car to shake hands with Ghoul, who was leaning on his gold-tipped staff. "Thanks for this much help," Jerry said. "Next time we meet, I'll tell you—" "We shall not meet again, my friend," Ghoul said with a half-smile. The words seemed definitely ominous to Jerry, but before he could say anything more, the old man had bowed ceremonially and then stepped back off the landing platform. The flying cars of Morn were shallow bowls of some gleaming blue metal, oval in shape and with 3 comfortably upholstered seats. They had no visible means of propulsion. Curved windshields of heavy glass protected the passengers from the air blast of swift motion. Jerry got in beside the pilot of the leading car, who was a slight and taciturn Mornian, with the big head and high forehead of his race. A complicated control board was fixed in place before him. Klozana and Portok were in the seat next behind, while 2 more members of the Viking's crew occupied the rear seat. "Ready?" the pilot asked. Jerry nodded. The pilot touched a switch on the control board before him, and 3 globular dials glowed with an iridescent light. The space car rose easily from the landing platform, moving upward and outward at a steep angle. There was neither noise nor vibration. The city vanished as soon as they passed outside the zone of dimensional control on its outer walls. Looking back and down, Jerry saw only the pitted rock of the foundations far below. A cart was moving toward the beach with some bars of metal for the Viking. Then the next flying car came into sight as it sped out beyond the walls. Its nose came into sight first, then the middle section, finally the whole car. One after another, the rest of the flotilla took off till they were flying in a V-shaped formation like a flock of wild geese. "What kind of power makes these cars go?" Jerry asked. "Isoelectronic rays," the pilot replied shortly, not taking his eyes from the indicator board. "And they can be made invisible like the city?" "Yes, the dimensional control lever is here." The pilot pointed at many of the controls, then again lapsed into silence. It was evident that Jerry was not going to be able to have any extended conversation with the driver of the car. That might be due to instructions the man had received from his superiors, or simply to his own nature. Probably a combination of both. These men of Morn were a cold and self-centered race. Probably they were an isolated offshoot of the original Old Ones, who had first settled this planet, a group who had managed to retain the scientific knowledge of their ancestors, but had lost the vigor and fire that are found in active and vital nations. Sure, whatever. Below them lay the greenish-yellow expanse of the Great Sea. Though these electronic flying cars of Morn traveled with a noiseless smoothness that was the last word in flying comfort, their speed was much less than that of the Viking at even minimum rocket power. The pilots were holding the flotilla down to a level of only a few hundred feet. The sight of the vast expanse of rippling waters sliding past so close below them was a strange experience to Jerry Norton, who had spent his life in spaceships that always traveled at the upper levels, where everything below looks like a gigantic patchwork quilt. Scattered islands shouldered their way upward through the sea ahead, and then sailed past below. So utterly smooth and noiseless was the movement of the electronic flying cars that they seemed to be standing motionless while a strong wind blew against their glass shields and the surface of the planet unrolled beneath them. It was well into the afternoon before the familiar mountain ranges bordering Savisa came into view ahead. Klozana was leaning forward on her seat, her eyes eager and youthful in the shadows of the steel helmet with which she had been fitted out from the Vikings' stores. Then, as the coastline became clearer with every passing mile, she suddenly pointed ahead and down to 2 black dots on the surface of the sea. The pilot took one glance at them, and then his hand moved to the dimensional control lever. When they had first entered the flying cars, Jerry had noticed that each one bore a very realistic-appearing metal bird at the end of a sort of flagstaff that protruded upward at the bow. At the time, he had thought it was simply a form of decoration. Now he realized that the metal bird fulfilled a much more useful purpose. It was outside the zone of invisibility, and gave all the pilots something to indicate the location of the other cars and avoid collisions. When he glanced back, all he could see was a flock of birds following them in a wide V. The flotilla was keeping formation. As they soared closer to shore, the 2 black dots gradually took shape as a pair of good-sized surface craft. A black-hulled raider, manned by a crew of the scaly ones, was hotly engaged with a wooden Savisan patrol boat. Companies of Amazons crouched behind the high bulwarks of their warship, loosing their arrows in stinging flights. Explosive bullets crackled around them as the scaly ones replied with their gas guns. The boat was equipped with a big charging tank for reloading the gas guns, equipment too heavy to be carried by land raiders, but possible here. The tide of battle was definitely setting against the Amazons. The bodies of many of the golden-haired feminine warriors lay sprawled in the scuppers or scattered on the riven decks. Klozana's fists were clenched as she peered down at the battle on the seas below. The decks of the Savisan craft were beginning to smolder, and her arrow fire was weakening. Klozana threw Jerry an agonized glance, and he turned to the pilot beside him. "Is there any way we can strike at that raider below?" he asked. The Mornian pilot smiled faintly, and then handed Jerry a long metal rod that was equipped with gun sights and had a sort of rubber stock. A wire trailed away from it and was attached to the car's power plant beneath the control board. It looked like an odd form of rifle, but the metal rod was solid instead of hollow. "Aim, then press the button," the taciturn Mornian said. Jerry brought the strange-looking weapon to his shoulder and sighted through a line of rings set in the top. He centered the crosshairs amidships on the black-hulled reptilian craft, then gently pressed the switch button set in the stock. There was a blinding flash of lightning. An instant later came the crashing roar of thunder. Momentarily, the flying car rocked under the buffeting of the disturbed masses. Then it steadied down again. On the sea below, the battle had come to an abrupt end. That single blow was enough. 7. The lightning bolt struck the Sea Raider amidships with a blinding flash. The metal hull glowed red hot. Water steamed about it. The dark shapes of scaly warriors went spinning off into the sea. Then the tank of gas amidships exploded, sending a sheet of blue flame high into the air. The Savisen warcraft rocked violently on the waves created by the lightning bolt and the explosion. The surviving Amazons clung frantically to bulwarks and rigging to avoid being washed overboard by the sheet of foam-flecked water that spread over the decks. Then, as their craft steadied down again, they looked up into the sky. All they could see was a flock of small birds speeding rapidly inland. They lifted their weapons to the sky in salute, a tribute to whatever dark gods had sped the deadly bolt that wrecked the enemy craft. Jerry gingerly handed the deadly lightning caster back to the pilot. "That's an effective weapon," he said. "If these flying cars can only stay with us for a few hours after we arrive at the city of Lar, we could probably break up the attack of the scaly ones and—" "We return to Morn immediately as soon as we have landed you in Lar," the pilot said with cold finality. "Those are the orders of the Council of Elders." Dusk caught them as they passed over the Savisen coastline. They saw the gleaming lights of various scattered towns and hamlets below them. An hour later, the lights of Lar itself came into view. At first, they were only aglow along the horizon. Then, as the flotilla of flying cars swept nearer, the lights of the city began to take on definite form and shape. Clozana was again leaning eagerly forward. "The lights look strange," she said. "So many of them are unsteady and flickering." Jerry Norton peered ahead through the night. His own eyes were narrowed and thoughtful. "Those flickering lights you see are ray guns," he said at last. "The city is already under siege." End of Part 8. So as a side note, the story In the Walls of Eryx by H.P. Lovecraft was written in 1936 and apparently published in 1939. Slightly after this story, in fact, even though it was written before, and it involved invisible walls on Venus, so I found that highly amusing.
The Golden Amazons of Venus by John Murray Reynolds. From Planet Stories, Winter 1939, as found on Project Gutenberg, narrated by Julie Hoverson. Music is from Zephon, as found on Jamindo.